Benjamin Netanyahu's story is not just one of politics. It's a story that weaves through the fabric of Israel's very identity. From a young man with grand dreams to a figure who would shape the future of a nation, Netanyahu's rise was both inevitable and contentious. But it's the hidden pieces of this journey, the decisions, the sacrifices, and the moments that aren't often told, that reveal the truth about his true motivations. These truths, concealed for years, could change the way you view one of the most polarizing figures in modern history. Born in 1949 in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's life was steeped in the complexities of Israel's struggle for survival. His father, Benzion Netanyahu, was a historian and a passionate Zionist who shaped his son's worldview. Raised in a home filled with discussions about Israel's place in the world, Benjamin absorbed lessons that would later drive his actions on the global stage. But the story of Netanyahu's rise to power doesn't start with his upbringing. It begins in the early years of his adult life, during a time when he was preparing to lead a nation. After completing his studies in the United States, Netanyahu returned to Israel, where his military service as a commando in Sayeret Matkal, an elite IDF unit, began to mold him into the leader he would become. His service in the military was not just about defending Israel. It was about embracing the idea of never backing down, of always fighting regardless of the odds. But what most don't realize is how this mentality would later translate into decisions that would put Israel on the edge of conflict, time and time again. In 1988, after completing his military service, Netanyahu turned his attention to politics. He wasn't just another ambitious politician. He was a man driven by a deep sense of duty to his country, a desire to see Israel secure in a dangerous world. His early foray into politics was met with skepticism by many. Could the son of a historian, a man with such an intellectual background, really understand the harsh realities of Israeli politics? But Netanyahu had a different vision, a vision of a stronger Israel, an Israel that would never again be caught off guard. His vision resonated with many, especially after the trauma of the Yom Kippur War and the fragile peace that followed. By the early 1990s, Netanyahu's rise was swift. In 1993, he was thrust into the spotlight after the Oslo Accords, a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO. Netanyahu's opposition to the peace process became his defining political stance. To him, the idea of peace with an enemy that had repeatedly sought Israel's destruction was a betrayal. He was not afraid to speak out, even if it meant standing against the tide of popular opinion. His strong, unyielding stance on security made him the voice of many Israelis who felt that peace was an illusion, a dangerous one at that. But Netanyahu's real moment came in 1996. With Israel still grappling with the aftershocks of the Oslo Accords, Netanyahu, then leader of the Likud party, was elected prime minister. It was a historic moment, a shift in the political landscape. Netanyahu's victory was not just a personal one. It was a victory for a new way of thinking about Israel's place in the world. His leadership promised to protect Israel from external threats, a promise that would define his tenure. Yet, Netanyahu's rise was not without controversy. His leadership was marked by intense debates over his policies, his approach to the Palestinian issue, and his relationships with the United States. While he promised strength and security, his critics argued that his policies were divisive and would only prolong the conflict. The peace process that had begun to take shape under previous leaders was now in jeopardy. As prime minister, Netanyahu's hardline stance on security was clear. He sought to strengthen Israel's position in the Middle East by asserting its military power and aligning with global superpowers, particularly the United States. However, behind closed doors, Netanyahu faced fierce opposition from within his own government. Many believed his uncompromising approach to security was isolating Israel on the world stage, making it harder to secure meaningful peace agreements. In 1999, Netanyahu lost his position as prime minister, but that defeat did not mark the end of his political career. Far from it. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Netanyahu returned to politics with an even greater resolve. His time out of office allowed him to refine his message, to become more pragmatic, while still holding on to the core beliefs that had propelled him to power in the first place. As Israel entered the 21st century, Netanyahu's political journey continued, and his leadership became even more polarizing. His return to the prime ministership in 2009 marked the beginning of a new era for Israel. Netanyahu had learned from his earlier mistakes. He was now more strategic, more focused on ensuring Israel's security in a rapidly changing world. The global political landscape was shifting, and Netanyahu knew that Israel could no longer afford to be passive in its dealings with the international community. Under his leadership, Israel faced a series of crises that tested his resolve. The threat of nuclear weapons in Iran, the ongoing conflict with Hamas, and the shifting alliances in the Middle East, all of these challenges shaped Netanyahu's decisions. He was unapologetic, fiercely defending Israel's right to exist and to protect itself by any means necessary. But again, his critics argued that his policies were too aggressive, that his refusal to compromise would lead to further isolation for Israel. Behind the headlines, however, there were darker truths about Netanyahu's time in office. Secrets about his personal relationships, his dealings with foreign powers, and his handling of certain sensitive situations were carefully guarded. Many of these secrets, when uncovered, revealed a man willing to go to extreme lengths to maintain control. His political maneuvering, the alliances he built, and the sacrifices he made were all part of a larger strategy. A strategy that has left many questioning the true nature of his leadership. Benjamin Netanyahu's time in power was marked by countless decisions that shaped not only Israel's future, but the very essence of the country's place in the world. What most people fail to understand, however, is how the hidden truths of his leadership reverberated through Israel's political landscape, its society, and its standing in the international arena. To fully comprehend the impact of Netanyahu's rule, we must look at the consequences of his policies and decisions, both the visible and the ones buried in the shadows. Netanyahu's tenure did not just change Israel's political climate. It set a course for a future that many Israelis were not prepared for. A future of uncertainty, division, and paradox. On the one hand, he succeeded in strengthening Israel's military capabilities, ensuring its survival in a turbulent region. On the other hand, he ignited conflicts that would leave deep scars on Israeli society. Conflicts that many feel are still unfolding today. One of Netanyahu's greatest achievements, according to his supporters, was his ability to position Israel as a dominant force in the Middle East. Under his leadership, Israel's defense capabilities reached new heights. His policies of military strength, technological advancement, and counterintelligence bolstered Israel's position as a regional superpower. But at what cost? While Israel became stronger, Netanyahu's approach also led to the erosion of trust within the international community. His firm stance on security, while admired by many, often came at the expense of Israel's relationships with neighboring countries and global powers. The ongoing conflict with Palestine, Netanyahu's refusal to engage in serious peace talks, and his skepticism of the two-state solution left Israel isolated. His policies alienated key allies, especially in Europe, where frustration grew over Israel's hardline approach. The two-state solution, a concept that many saw as the key to lasting peace, was effectively sidelined under Netanyahu's leadership. What made this even more complex was Netanyahu's ability to manipulate political narratives. He used rhetoric that spoke to the hearts of Israelis, positioning himself as the protector of their nation. Yet, behind this public persona, there were calculated political moves designed to ensure his own political survival. He knew how to unite the public against common enemies, to stir up nationalism, and to portray any criticism of his policies as a threat to Israel's very existence. But the truth is that Netanyahu's rise to power and his hold on it were also rooted in a deep understanding of human psychology, especially fear. By constantly highlighting external threats, he kept the population in a state of fear and urgency, which ultimately justified his hardline policies. It was a masterstroke of political manipulation, but it also left a deep emotional toll on Israeli society. The constant drumbeat of security threats made people more divided, more afraid, and less willing to consider alternatives. Internally, Netanyahu's leadership ignited a divide that has shaped Israeli society. While some saw his policies as essential for national security, others saw them as a betrayal of Israel's founding values. Values of peace, coexistence, and social justice. His leadership, for all its strengths, came at the expense of unity. The deepening rift between Israelis who supported his hardline policies and those who called for a more peaceful approach fractured society in ways that have yet to heal. The social fabric of Israel was torn apart under Netanyahu's reign. The polarization of opinions was palpable. His critics, often left-wing Israelis, felt that Netanyahu had steered the country away from its moral compass. His government's treatment of Palestinians, its expansion of settlements, and its refusal to make concessions for peace sparked protests, movements, and public outrage. What began as an ideological battle slowly morphed into an emotional one, with the country's soul seemingly on the line. Even within Netanyahu's own coalition, divisions grew. While he kept his political rivals at bay, cracks within his government began to show. Ministers and party members who once stood by him started to challenge his policies, publicly disagreeing with his approach. This instability revealed the underlying uncertainty of Netanyahu's leadership, a man who, while successful in consolidating power, struggled to maintain long-term unity within his own ranks. Economically, Netanyahu's policies brought both growth and turmoil. His economic strategy focused on free market reforms, trade agreements, and creating a strong tech sector that became the envy of many. Israel's startup culture flourished, and the country's economy grew at an impressive pace. Yet, this growth was not evenly distributed. The gap between the wealthy elite and the working class widened, creating tensions that threatened to boil over. For the average Israeli citizen, the benefits of Netanyahu's economic policies were often overshadowed by the emotional and social cost of his leadership. The divide between those who thrived under his economic system and those who struggled became a source of bitter resentment. What was supposed to be a model of prosperity for all turned into a stark reminder of inequality. Netanyahu's foreign policy is often seen as a balancing act between pursuing Israel's security interests and maintaining diplomatic relations with global superpowers. But his tenure also marked a shift in how Israel interacted with the world. Under Netanyahu, Israel's relationship with the United States became a unique one. Intense, personal, and at times, volatile. Netanyahu's unyielding stance on security made him both a partner and a rival to the U.S., especially under the administration of Barack Obama. While Netanyahu found a staunch ally in Donald Trump, who fully supported his hardline policies, he also alienated others in the international community. His decision to align so closely with certain global powers, particularly the U.S., came at a cost. His disregard for European concerns, especially regarding the Iranian nuclear deal, created friction that has yet to be fully resolved. In fact, Netanyahu's refusal to compromise on major diplomatic issues led to growing tensions not just with his neighbors, but with countries that once viewed Israel as a partner in the region. As Netanyahu's career progressed, he faced increased scrutiny, both domestically and internationally. The hidden truths about his leadership, those moments of political maneuvering that were carefully concealed, began to surface. With every decision came the inevitable consequences: a weakened international standing, a divided society, and a nation at a crossroads. The real impact of Netanyahu's rule is still unfolding. How will history judge him? Will he be remembered as the savior of Israel, the man who ensured its survival in a hostile world? Or will he be remembered as the architect of a divided nation, a leader whose ambition overshadowed the very values Israel was built upon? It is easy to focus on the victories, the peace deals, the military strength, the economic growth. But the hidden truths about Netanyahu's time in power suggest that these successes may have come at a much higher cost than most are willing to admit. As we look back at his legacy, we are left to wonder, what was the true price of his leadership, and who really paid it? As the story of Benjamin Netanyahu's rise to power unfolds before us, we are confronted with a complex and sometimes unsettling reality. From the outside, Netanyahu has always appeared as a man driven by a singular purpose: to ensure Israel's survival and dominance in a tumultuous world. But as we peel back the layers of his leadership, we uncover truths that challenge the carefully constructed image of a patriot and protector. These hidden truths do not just shift our perception of Netanyahu. They challenge the very foundation of the political system that allowed him to rise and stay at the top for so long. In this journey, we've seen Netanyahu's unyielding determination to maintain control at all costs, his manipulation of national security fears, his steadfast opposition to any form of compromise in the Middle East, and his sharp political maneuvering that ensured his position remained secure even when his popularity faltered. These traits, while undoubtedly making him a formidable leader, also led to decisions that have had long-lasting consequences for Israel and its people. We can no longer ignore the emotional toll that Netanyahu's leadership has taken on the Israeli public. The divide within the nation, the tension between those who supported his hardline policies and those who felt that Israel was losing its moral compass, has only grown wider. Netanyahu's ability to position himself as the protector of Israel allowed him to maintain power. But at what cost? The truth, as we've seen, is far more nuanced, and understanding it requires us to confront uncomfortable realities. When we look back at the emotional impact of Netanyahu's time in power, it's clear that his leadership was as much about creating fear as it was about offering security. Netanyahu was not just securing Israel's borders, he was securing his own legacy, manipulating the national conversation in a way that ensured his place in history. But what happens when the national conversation is controlled by fear? When every conflict is framed as an existential threat, and every critique of government policy is painted as a betrayal? The emotional cost of Netanyahu's leadership is evident in the widening chasm between Israelis who believe in his vision of a strong, self-sufficient nation and those who view his actions as leading Israel further away from peace and moral integrity. His leadership forced Israelis to choose sides in a battle that was as much ideological as it was emotional. On one hand, there were those who celebrated Netanyahu as the man who kept Israel safe, who made Israel stronger on the world stage. On the other hand, there were those who felt betrayed by his refusal to seek peace, by his manipulation of national security fears to maintain his grip on power. This emotional divide has left scars that may take years to heal. Netanyahu's policies and rhetoric were designed to create unity through fear. But the unity he sought was superficial. It was based on an idea of national security that ignored the human cost of his decisions. For every military victory, for every step Israel took toward strengthening its borders, there was a corresponding loss. The people who had once hoped for peace, for a future in which Israelis and Palestinians could coexist, found themselves marginalized and silenced. And yet, Netanyahu's mastery of political rhetoric and media manipulation allowed him to maintain a firm grip on public sentiment. His supporters, enamored by his strength and conviction, remained loyal even in the face of mounting evidence that his policies were failing. Netanyahu had created a narrative so powerful that questioning him became synonymous with questioning Israel's very right to exist. But the emotional price of this loyalty was steep. Those who supported him did so at the expense of their own moral compass, choosing security over compassion, fear over understanding. The deeper we dive into Netanyahu's legacy, the more we realize that it is a legacy built on contradictions. On one hand, he strengthened Israel's military, secured alliances with powerful nations, and ensured Israel's place as a regional superpower. He made Israel a force to be reckoned with, both in the Middle East and on the global stage. But these victories were not without their consequences. The international community grew increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu's refusal to compromise on key issues, such as the Palestinian question and the Iranian nuclear threat. Netanyahu's legacy is also one of isolation. While he forged strong ties with the United States, especially during the Trump administration, his relationship with Europe and other key allies became strained. Netanyahu's hardline policies, especially his continued settlement expansion and his steadfast opposition to a two-state solution, alienated many of Israel's traditional allies. The result was a paradox. Israel grew stronger militarily, but its political standing in the international community weakened. The very actions that Netanyahu believed would protect Israel ultimately pushed the nation further into a corner, isolated from the rest of the world. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Netanyahu's legacy is the question of what could have been. What if, instead of building walls and solidifying military might, Netanyahu had chosen to build bridges? What if, instead of fueling fear, he had embraced the possibility of peace, of a shared future with the Palestinians? What would Israel look like today if Netanyahu had taken a different path? These are the questions that linger, unanswered. And it's these unresolved questions that will continue to shape Netanyahu's legacy for years to come. The impact of his leadership has not yet fully played out. The consequences of his decisions are still unfolding, and only time will tell whether the damage he has done to Israel's moral standing can be undone. As we reflect on Netanyahu's rule, we are left with more questions than answers. We know that his leadership brought both strength and division. We know that his policies created a stronger military and a more prosperous economy, but at the same time, they deepened the rift between Israelis and Palestinians, between Israel and its allies. We know that Netanyahu's legacy is one of contradiction, a legacy that has left an indelible mark on the nation's psyche. But what happens now? What will Israel look like after Netanyahu? Can the country heal from the wounds his leadership has inflicted? Will future leaders learn from his mistakes, or will they follow in his footsteps, choosing fear and division over unity and peace? These are the questions that demand answers. And the truth is, only time will tell. Netanyahu's impact on Israel is far from over. His legacy is still being written, and the story of his rule continues to unfold before our eyes. The emotional toll of his leadership, the political consequences of his actions, and the social divisions he has created will shape Israel for generations to come. The hidden truths we've uncovered about Netanyahu are just the beginning of a much larger story. A story that raises more questions than it answers. A story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable realities of power, politics, and leadership. And while we may never know all the answers, one thing is certain. The impact of Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership will continue to reverberate for years to come. So, as we close this chapter, we leave you with a thought. What do you believe? Do you think Netanyahu was a hero who protected Israel at all costs? Or was he a leader whose actions led Israel down a dangerous path of isolation and division? The truth is there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. But the real question is, are we ready to face it? If you're fascinated by the hidden truths behind Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership and want to dive deeper into this complex story, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Watch the full video for more shocking insights, and don't forget to like the video if you found it eye-opening. Stay tuned for more.